I want you to basically memorize what Tim and Martin just said. And I'm going to give you a picture from the beach at a lower level. Fisheries and climate change have much in common. The oceans and the atmosphere are common property, complex adaptive systems, has been said before. The oceans do not only provide fish, they also absorb greenhouse gases and provide oxygen. So they're directly linked. Both in fisheries and in the atmosphere, we basically borrow from the future. We use excessive fish catches and the release of greenhouse gases that cause substantial instability, and they require political action and feedback at multiple levels to guide that change. In fisheries management, we've tried to do this for the past 75 years, and we have learned a lot of lessons. There were mostly painful lessons. We have messed up a lot of things in order to address change, and that is why I think this may be also give examples of what not to do when you look at climate change. I don't want to talk about fisheries per se, just say that mankind is basically catching only the big fish in the oceans. And as a result of that, their biomass declines very substantially. But as a result of that, the ecosystem itself is changing very substantially. And we haven't really been able to figure out how to deal with that in one way or another. I think if you look at the global catch of marine fish, about 80% of that is comprised of 15 fish families. So we are really targeting only a limited number of fish. Now, fisheries is not only bad news, there's also good news. The oceans provide or grow a lot of protein. And if you have a growing population, it is definitely feasible to increase the amount of protein for the future population. And I say this because the ocean has a number of species that we are not catching, particularly mesopelagic species. If you go to your local fish shop and you ask for lanternfish, they won't be able to provide it. Still, there is about 10 billion tons of mesopelagic species in the oceans. They're the great commuters. They move during the night, they move to the surface of the oceans to feed. And when the light comes on, they dive back to about 500 meters depth to stay in the dark. There are also alternatives for the current fishing methods that are very energy intensive, particularly trawling. If you go to a fancy restaurant and you ask for a fillet of sole, I think very few people realize that it takes about 8 kilos of diesel fuel in order to get 1 kilo of fillet of sole on your plate. Similarly, environmentally damaging aquaculture also exists. Salmon culture releases, according to a recent report, about 7 kilos of CO2 in the atmosphere when they produce 1 kilo of salmon. Shrimp, particularly in tropical areas, has substantially reduced mangrove forests, which are the natural way to deal with rising sea levels. A lot of things are possible technically and economically if we were a little bit more environmentally interested in what is happening. Still, current exploitation levels and also consumption levels are highly uneven. It is difficult, and as Tim and Martin were saying, it is difficult to change the way mankind is looking at fish. What you see here is an annual event whereby a bunch of young people are allowed to kill a number of bottlenose dolphins. This is happening in all places in Denmark, and there are many people who come here to watch the scene. So fisheries management has to deal with this collective action trap. Fisheries management has for a long time not been seen as a political process to manage disruption in a complex system. It has been dominated by scientists that were basically using very simplistic models in order to guide how much fish should be taken. As has been said before, fisheries management deals with a limited resource. So it requires a long-term vision. It requires leadership to lead to that long-term vision. It has relied in many countries on a weak, siloed institutional framework, regulations, funding, enforcement, adjudication, the use of science, all those things were handled by separate agencies that basically hardly talk to each other. And my private gripe is that it has been based on prevailing economic and scientific theories. Simplistic models that optimize in a complex system is ridiculous, and we've been doing it for a very long time. These models don't deal with social safety nets, with risks, with fairness, with ecosystem impact, and a lot of other things. They have used one size fits all in approaching or in their approach, and ignoring local culture, sector dependence, who pays and who benefits, not only in the immediate future, but also in the long term. So I would like you to give 4 brief examples of where fisheries management reasonably worked better. And one is the Lofoten cod fishery. People have been fishing for cod there about 6,000 years and have been highly dependent on catching cod, which is a seasonal fishery. The fish come there to spawn during the winter. The local community has been basically using this fishing as source of their main source of protein. And for political reasons, particularly during the Middle Ages and also until the 19th or the beginning of the 20th century, these guys were dominant or forced to actually sell their fish to a monopoly of traders in Bergen. When that stopped, they basically decided to keep the management of their resource in their own hands. So the local community has set long-term goals that are maintaining stability, maintaining their own culture, maintaining technology and markets, and not over-exploiting their resource, not becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. They want to stay as they are. Because of the political history, they were allowed quite substantial political interference from Bergen and from Oslo has been relatively limited. So they were allowed to do this. They get scientific support, but basically local experience governs, and they decide how much they want to fish and what they want to do with the fish. So the drivers in this whole system have been the local community, history to some extent, but also political support for them to basically be left alone. In Japan, you have a very similar system nationwide, which also has a very long history. Japan has been dependent on fish for a very long time as its main source of protein. During the Edo area, 17th, 19th century, they basically broke up their fisheries into 3 categories: local, regional, and oceanic. And in 1901 and 1949, they legalized the entire system using, of all things, German legislation. And so you have, particularly at the local level, one cooperative covering a few villages that manages all fisheries, aquaculture, infrastructure in that limited area. They have very strong community leadership, social cohesion, fairness. There's extensive use of traditional knowledge. There's modest exploitation levels. They don't really overfish there. And there's clear economic autonomy. The regional and national fisheries are handled by different committees, and they have a very interesting flexible conflict resolution system, which allows them to deal with conflicts between these various groups and various fisheries. Also, at the national level and at the local level, there's an understanding that to maintain fisheries, you have to make adjustments when it is necessary. And in this case, what was necessary is that they couldn't crew their oceanic tuna fleets anymore because people didn't want to work 20 hours a day for 6 months at a time. So they had to basically get rid of their tuna fleets, and that was funded by both the national level, but also at local and provincial levels. So there is a clear understanding adjusting to new situations requires efforts from everyone. So the drivers in this particular case are both at the national level. Fisheries Agency is one of the ministries of fisheries that has standing in a country. In most countries, fisheries ministries are kind of junior ministries, not so in Japan. It's regional and local communities that have been extremely interested, but also the industry has been really pushing to maintain the current system. I want to say a few words about the common fishery policy. It has a long history and it has everything related to Brussels, focused on science, institutions, rule and finance. And if you look at the Brexit negotiations, you see how that works out. Just two or three positive and negatives. First of all, Brussels realized that they have to provide a frame for the long-term future. That frame hasn't been accepted in many places still, but the very fact that they are realizing that they have to move towards a different situation, I think is positive. Also, they have, from the very beginning, provided substantial money to address the downsizing of the far too large fleet. Some of that money has been misused, substantially misused for a long period of time. And as a Dutchman, I can admit that the Dutch were some of the people that really misused this money on a grand scale. But right now, I think they are better targeting this money in order to create more sustainable fisheries. The whole system has been slow at multiple levels, and that is one, I think, of the weaknesses of the Brussels approach. On the other hand, as a result of that, they underestimated factors like uncertainty, trust, and fairness in the system. Drivers in Europe have been, of all things, the European Parliament has been very active in trying to move this process along. So have NGOs, local producer organizations in some countries were very vocal. And last but not least, the media have done quite a bit. West Africa, just a few words. There's quite a bit of fish in West Africa between Mauritania and Nigeria, which has been caught mainly by small-scale fishermen. Two things happened. First of all, because of the desertification at the Sahel, many small farmers moved to the coast and ended up as crew on the small-scale fishing boats. Right now, there are about 5 million small-scale fishermen supplying local markets. At the same time, improvements in fisheries management forced a lot of particularly older industrial fishing vessels to move elsewhere, and they ended up reflagged in many cases in Africa. So there are about 500 illicitly fishing industrial fishing vessels for export right now. At the same time, West Africa imports 1.5 million tons of frozen fish. In the beginning, during the 80s and 90s, individual countries set up small projects to try to deal with this whole problem. It didn't really work. The World Bank started about 10 years ago to look at a regional program to deal with this. And I've been partly involved in this. What we try to do is work at very different levels, at many levels, in order to address some of these problems. What I understand from somebody who's still involved in this right now is that one of the things that we wanted to do is to move the industrial fleet out of the local coastal waters. If you go to the beach in West Africa in the past, you could see the lights of the industrial fishing vessels almost fishing close to the beach. Now I understand in most countries there is a 6-mile exclusive coastal zone, mostly enforced. So that's positive. One of the things that really happened in this particular case that was useful is satellite technology. Also fast internet coordination between various parties and also external regional leadership. There's no tipping point yet, but getting things moving in West Africa by itself is positive. So I think this is moving in the right direction. Who were driving this? Fishermen, local media, parliaments in some cases, parliamentarians, NGOs, and even the World Bank. What came out of this is that timing of measures is critical. Sometimes you have to wait to do certain things. At other times, you have to move very fast. Lessons from fisheries, maybe for climate change, create permanent multi-level pressure to encourage change, identify and support drivers that can move key stakeholders, big and small, seek acceptance of long-term vision, accept multiple narratives of change, even paradoxes, and finally, reduce uncertainty and seek fairness to get acceptance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gert. There's a number of questions for you. I think there's a short one by Wilhelm Krul that he thanks you for the Lofoten example, but he'd like to know where the interfaces between science and local community, how they were managed. Can you say a few words on that?
Yes, the interchange between science and the communities has been an endless little war. Scientists have had difficulties with fishermen for a very long time. And on the other hand, fishermen have even more problems with scientists also for a very long time. There are exceptions, thank goodness. And I think the whole situation is improving. But for a very long time, these guys really did not really communicate. They might have talked to each other and drank coffee together on the boat, but really talking about what they were doing and what the differences were has been a very, very difficult process.
All right, then maybe one last question from Jan Staman, both to you and to Tim. Is there in agri-economics a leading theory on change and transitions considering the low price paradigm?
Just briefly, no. When I tried to get the argument published, a group of economists told me it was heresy to think like that. And I think, you know, my background is thinking about non-linear systems and complex system change and all the rest of that, whereas most economists tend to think in terms of linear systems. And so actually thinking through the complexity of this area is slightly anathematous to current economic thinking. But Das Gupta's great report does give a potential framing for thinking through the consequences of internalizing externalities in more sophisticated ways than people normally do. So no, it's the answer, I think.
Okay. Anything to add to that?
As already mentioned, I mean, the models that have been used by biologists and by economists in bioeconomic models, in both cases, they're optimizing models focusing on a single objective. And as I said before, in a complex system, that's totally ridiculous. So the science that we have used, or the models that we have used, really need to be adjusted. And I agree with Tim. This linear thinking in economics is ridiculous. We have to get away from it. And I also agree that the Gupta report, I hope, will get a very wide reading because I think it's very important.